Peter, and I want to go back just a little bit of the end of chapter 4, because while we did get through 4, the last part I'd really like to go over a little bit because it relates back to what's covered in Matthew a bit. So in 1 Peter chapter 4, I'd like to go ahead and start back at verse 12. That gives us a little bit of the context. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you are sharing Christ's suffering, so that you may also be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting on you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. Yet, if any of you suffers as a Christian, do not consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear his name. For the time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God. If it begins with us, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? And it is hard for the righteous to be saved. What will become of the ungodly and the sinners? Therefore, let those suffering in accordance with God's will entrust themselves to a faithful Creator while continuing to be good. Okay, it's verse 17 and beyond that I'd like to discuss. For the time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God. If it begins with us, what will be the end for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And just to put a bit of a context to that, if we look back at Matthew chapter 24, beginning with verse 15, it reads, So, when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down to take what is in the house. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So, the persecution that Jesus was talking about, he said, nothing before and nothing after will measure up to what's about to happen. Peter, in writing to them, is talking about what's about to happen. That the persecution is coming, and where does it begin? Persecution begins in the church. It begins with the church first by the Jews, and we saw that in Acts with Paul, before he's called Paul when he's Saul. But shortly after the Jews are going to make a huge tactical mistake. Rome tolerated religions in conquered areas. Tolerated. If the religion already existed, then it was acceptable. If it was a new religion, there is no religion other than Caesar is God. Any new religion was treason. The Jews, knowing this and still having quasi-favor with Rome, got it straightened out. Hey, pay attention. Christianity is not a variation on Judaism. It's a new religion. And that's when the Roman persecution began in earnest. However, guilt by association, while it was the Christians that were the ones committing treason, where did this all begin? It began with the Jews. So the persecution continues for the Christians, but gets a lot worse. But being the ones who pointed the finger and said, hey, look at them, they're new, And where did they begin? With you. So both see a lot of persecution. The Christians see the worst of it. Jerusalem gets wiped out in 70 AD. Scorched earth, level it kind of policy. At that same time, it's not just that Rome is coming in and doing the nasty. God has a reason to be ticked off. At that time, there is a man named Bar Jesus, which means son of Jesus. And at that time that he is trying to claim to be the new Messiah, the high priest at that time declares Bar Jesus to be the Son of God. And Bar Jesus says, God the Father can sit this one out. I'm here to take care of things. And the high priest says, yeah, this is the one. Jesus came 40 years before this, died on the cross 40 years before this, and now the high priest declares this other individual to be the Son of God. It's not just a coincidence that it's one of those squishy thumb kind of moments where the thumb comes down and goes. If I was God, I'd be pretty ticked off with that maneuver too. Because his son did come. The political elites denied it. But as I've said, come 70 AD, the Christians have pretty much left Jerusalem. None of the functional priests, from what they could find evidence-wise, were in Jerusalem when it gets destroyed by Rome. Why? They'd become Christians and fled like all the other Christians. There aren't that many that they could identify as being Christian, archaeological dig-wise, that were found in the level where Jerusalem got destroyed. Because God said, you need to leave. You need to flee and don't look back. And they did. Now, when we look at what Peter is writing about, he's writing just before that level of persecution is about to occur. And he's letting them know it's going to start with the church. Now, we're looking at this from history's perspective. Where did it begin? It began with the church. Began with. Did it stop there? No. It spread out. How much? Jerusalem gets destroyed in its entirety. So from a historical perspective, this is fulfilled. From the time when Peter's writing it, around 64 to 66 AD, hasn't happened yet. Right now it's still predominantly the Jews that are doing the persecution. Rome is just in the earliest stages. So the time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God. What is your perspective on what he's saying here? Yes?
My feeling is that he's given them an insight as to how to prepare yourself. If you think things are bad now, it's going to be even worse.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of saying that, you know, that hey, this world is temporary. You've got a better life. You know, just knowing that God is there and he's going to, you know, and that he's in control.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to trust in that. Even though things get bad, he's still there. He's still in control.
Mm-hmm. Now, I brought up Matthew, and I'm agreeing 100% with everything you said. I brought up Matthew because when Jesus starts talking about this time of trial, etc., that's going to be cut short. The apostles say, this we understand, which is sort of almost comical when you realize how much they didn't understand. But Jesus doesn't laugh at them and say, no, you guys are, you're not really getting it. From an Old Testament perspective, they could look back and see God's judgment. Sometimes against Jerusalem and Judea, sometimes against the northern tribes, sometimes against other nations even. When it goes up against Esau and his descendants, the Edomites, it talks about God coming down, and where his foot lands, mountains are made low and valleys are pushed up. When he swings his sword, he will bathe the mountain in blood. That sounds like a pretty intense kind of God judgment moment. What ends up happening in that particular instance is Israel's going up against the Edomites. And they defeat them in battle, and the Edomites go running. And they go running in a pretty poor direction. They go running up this hillside, and at the top of the hill is a cliff face. And those that don't die on the run up get pushed off the cliff face. The mountainside was bathed in blood. So they had something they could be looking back at in the Old Testament and say, yeah, God's judgment can be really serious, really swift sometimes. But it could also be long and drawn out as well. They saw it back with David. Okay, you got your three choices. You can spend time fleeing from your enemy. You can suffer this way, or you can suffer this way. And David says, I'm throwing my mercy on the court. I trust you better than I trust myself. Do it your way, God. And God gives him a little bit of all three for a shorter period of time. They understood God's judgment was serious. What do you think about the part about the persecution coming to the church first?
Well, when did Peter die? When did Paul die?
Mm-hmm.
When did, a lot of the apostles, when were they killed? During this time period.
Yeah. I think John is the only one that lives past 70 AD.
And to think that all these voices were snuffed out,
Mm-hmm.
and how Christians probably, hey, if Peter's killed, that's the rock.
Yep.
And all these apostles, the abilities that they had in healing, and and the works that they could do, I think it's a very troublesome time.
One additional point about that is, as far as the miraculous goes, by pretty much 100 AD, it's gone. It's not carried forward. It was the apostles and those whom they laid hands upon that had the miraculous powers, or in the case of Cornelius and his family being the one exception, where in a way different, and see, that's the other thing for those in the Pentecostal area, it was different. How different? Scripture tells us Peter came laying on of hands in the instance where it hadn't occurred with the Samaritans because it was wrong teaching. Outside of laying on of hands and Cornelius' situation, this was a radically different thing. It wasn't everybody had it. So to hear that end is coming, to hear that that judgment is coming, did anybody see God's leg when he stomped on the mountain in the Old Testament? No. It was a figurative kind of statement. But what did it mean when it said God came down for judgment. It meant God came, but not in a physical way. Unfortunately, when it says coming soon for the second coming of Christ, a lot of people look at that from the perspective, oh, well, we're going to see him and it's going to be like. What was it like when Christ was here? He did miracles. People were healed. People were fed. People were raised from the dead. What was it like during the persecution? They were performing the miracles Christ had performed. They were being killed in many cases, just like Christ was. Many of the apostles were crucified. I believe it was Peter that was crucified upside down. We look at that and we forget, what did it mean to be a day of the Lord in the Old Testament? Day of the Lord in the Old Testament was judgment. If Christ was coming again and he was Lord, what was that really being told? A day of judgment. If we work from our knowledge of the Old Testament, work with that language relative to the New Testament and the apostles' understanding, a false doctrine that got put out at that time by some was, he's coming soon. I'm waiting for the rapture, so I am quitting my day job. I don't need to work. Why? He's coming soon. If you look at the entirety of Scripture, Old Testament prophecy, when it says something is about to happen, the only time it doesn't happen in about to, meaning within one generation, is when he comes right out and says, seal this up, it's not for your time. Even prophecies about Christ had an immediate fulfillment. Not because Christ came immediately, but because they were in need of, and God provided within that generation. Or consequence was coming within that generation. The virgin shall be with child, and before the child is old enough to know, the kingdom from the north shall come down and destroy you all. The virgin shall be with child. Well, that's obviously about Jesus. No, it was also about what was going to happen within less than 13 years. Kingdom from the north came down. Was it also prophesying about Christ? Yes. But it was tagged also with an immediate fulfillment. Your seed shall be a blessing to the rest of the world. And I'm totally misquoting that, but you know what I'm talking about. Abraham. Through your seed, all nations of the world shall be blessed. Through your seed, singular. And it identifies that the seed didn't pass through Esau. The seed passed through Jacob. Seed was already processed going forward. That fulfillment was occurring. His descendants inherited all of that land God gave. It's what we've been discussing with Joshua. There's many prophecies about Christ through Abraham, through David, but yet, did they receive the blessing of the land? Yes, they did. That wasn't talking about when Jesus came. It was talking about an immediate fulfillment. Same thing for David. A lot of the times he's talking, you're looking at that, and if you didn't know about Jesus, you'd think David's talking about David. And he was. But he was also talking about Christ. Solomon, when he makes the prophecies, he's making prophecies about what he's seeing coming down the road after him. And boy, it isn't pretty. It wasn't pretty what happened with Christ either and what would come afterwards. You don't know. What happens when Christ comes? Think about Solomon, wisest person in the world. What happens right after him? The nation splits. Does that stop God's fulfillment in Christ? No. Does the judgment and destruction that occurs immediately following Christ being here stop it all? No. Matthew is when he tells us, and it's also in Mark, these days were shortened, because if they weren't, the elect wouldn't survive. Well, wait a second. If this is the end of the world, the elect doesn't need to survive because it's all come to an end. That's not what it was talking about. It was talking about judgment in the same kind of perspective as what they knew and understood from the Old Testament. So when Peter's talking about the persecution that is coming, he's not trying to communicate to them, hey, just get through it. Because once that persecution is over, the world's over anyways. He's letting them know because he understood it when Jesus said it. The persecution's coming. The judgment is coming. God is coming down in a way that you understand from the Old Testament. Who's God? Jesus is as well. His second coming, a time of miracle. A time when they understood God was with these people in spite of everything that's going against them. Think about that. The persecution was so bad, they're killing those who can perform miracles. That lets you know how far off society had gotten. Now, when we face the same kind of situations, when society goes totally wonky donkey down the toilet, where's persecution going to hit hardest fast? In the church. Why? Because we're going against wonky donkey. Yes, sir.
Well, and that's where I see the major problem is. How are we suffering and sacrificing and getting persecuted right now? You know, do we recognize what sacrifice is or what persecution is? You know, I'm not quite sure. Some people say if I've got to walk out in the sun to get to the air-conditioned car to go to church, I'm sacrificing my, you know, I'm serious now. So what do we do?
I know you're serious.
You know, and instead of being willing to suffer and sacrifice in the face of the tribulation, we just say, well, we're going to let it slide. You know, I mean, you know, it's like John Kennedy said, you know, that's not what my country should do. What can it? We should ask the same question about Christianity. It's not asking what Christianity, what can I do to keep Christianity going and to make it better? You know?
Yeah.
But we're willing to just roll over because, well, if I make a statement and I'm a businessman, my advertisers and my supporters will win, so I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm just going to roll over. So how are, in the 21st century, right now today, how are the Christians suffering and sacrificing? What, specifically, what are they doing to, you know, to suffer and sacrifice for Christ? I'm not quite sure. There's not a lot of evidence that we are.
I am glad you brought that up. I am glad you said it the way you said it. Because let's take that and take it all the way back to when Jesus came. How bad were the Jews suffering at that time? Not too horrendously. It wasn't pleasant. Rome was large and in charge, and when they got ticked off, they could make it feel really uncomfortable. But it wasn't that bad. The answer comes. What do? Instead of acknowledging and working with the answer, the one that's feeding them, the one that's healing them, they fight against it. And the persecution gets a little bit worse. They kill him. And his apostles start doing the exact same thing all over, pointing back to a crucified Christ. Well, let's really ramp this up. The persecution doesn't start out brutally intensive. It starts out in little ways. And you're right. A lot of people think I suffer. And their definition of suffer, I get up on Sunday mornings and I go to church instead of sleeping in. That's suffering. I go at least 3 times a month. I'm committed. We got some scary definitions used relative to suffering, relative to commitment. And unfortunately, it's a mindset that didn't just spring up yesterday. In too many cases, the behavior is a learned behavior. Well, Dad always only went on Sunday morning. That's good enough for me. Except Dad might have been there every single Sunday morning. Good enough for me is I'm there most Sunday mornings. Too many times, the example that's followed isn't an exact copy. It's like the old things, and we're all old enough to remember, carbon copies. You know, that first one you printed out, that looked really, really good and nice and crisp. Down through about the 100th or so copy, it starts to get fuzzy on the edges of the print. Then if you take it just a little too far, the whole thing gets sort of speckled and you really can't tell what it was. The problem with the church, there's a reason why church growth looks like that. Starts out from nothing, goes all the way up, then comes back down like a bell curve. Because the first part of the curve is when the church is really being the church. It's when you get to the middle of the rise that it stops doing what it did from here to get to there. And a lot start doing what they see inside the 4 walls only. And because the behavior, instead of being what it was to begin with, becomes, well, we come together and we do this church thing, it starts tapering off until it actually starts dying off. And in many cases, that cycle is a 75-year cycle. And you look at a lot of congregations, and they'll sort of hit that top number. Guess what? That top number is a double lie. Because in most places where they hit that top, population has been growing at a faster rate than the church did during that last part of the rise. So actually the last part of that rise in the bell curve isn't even a rise. That's population or less than population growth. It's actually dying before it hits the peak and doesn't realize it. And what happens is we're now into that fuzzy stage of the copy. And if we don't go back to what it was that really got it going to begin with, it dies off. Because if all that happens is a worse and worse copy of what they think is going on inside of the 4 walls, it doesn't last. And I believe if we did a study, I cannot find anything on this though, at least not long term. You'd find the same kind of thing with families in a lot of instances, where the first generation one, they're the ones that were convinced, convicted, and were striving. The second generation crowd, unfortunately, has the worst statistic. Less than 40% of second generation, sorry I keep doing that, I'll have to back up. Less than 40% of second generation survive as Christians. I want to say it is almost 70% leave the church. Now, if you manage to be one of the few that survived out of second generation, the likelihood that your kids, third generation, will stay on is like 83% or higher. Because this crowd tended to survive because they got what their parents got. Not all of them. But again, like I said, that part we don't have the full study on. We just see the first 2-3 generations. I can't find anything on the fourth. But what makes a person a Christian? Is it attendance? And everybody's shaking their heads, right? It's not. Because if that's all it is, there's a reason why people walk away from it. Because, well, I attend school better than I attend church. I attend my job better than I attend church. My commitment to a have to, God's not a have to. It's like Boone was bringing up. Suffering. We set that bar super, super low. Commitment. We set it just about as low. We don't convince and convict. And unfortunately, this goes back to the movement in the 50s and 60s. We were trying to smart them into the church. I can convince you that your version of Christianity isn't right, and here's how I can convince you. I'll smart you into it. That's not a change of heart. That's a dodging annoyance. That's why, unfortunately, 65% of the people in the Church of Christ, when they move from one location to another, will also change denominations. Because like I said, the conviction is really down there low. They're not convicted of a truth. I believe they're convicted of, I don't want to go to hell. And I'm more comfortable not going to hell here right now. This group has a better kids program, and they may not be right, but at least my kids will be attending somewhere then, yeah.
Well, let me make sure I ask this question right. Is it those that are convinced that Jesus is Lord that are staying, or is it those that are convinced that Jesus is Lord is leaving? Because of what they see in the church.
That's an interesting question, especially at this time. More so than in the past. Because right now, you are correct. The majority of those leaving are leaving because they do not find in the congregations that they are in that the church is about God's will. Because the church has been about attendance in those locations, the majority of the people that you will read about in exit interviews, why did you leave? I can do more for God by being part of X, Y, and Z. When the homosexual community is doing more to feed those in need than the church, why am I persecuting the homosexual community? Because they do more good than God's people. You're right. the example has gotten so bad in many cases that God's people look bad in comparison to the world. Yes?
And of course, every church has their own explanations of why. Well, you know, we're this and we're that, and we can't, and they can just, you know, rationalize anything. And that's what they do. Well, we're not doing that because, and so we're okay because of that. I don't understand that. Well, maybe.
Well, and it's, oh boy, it's a many-pronged problem. Problem number one, getting people to feel like they're a functional, necessary part of the body. It's one thing to say, we are giving to support Mount Dora, to support the children's home up in Georgia, to support. Well, that's giving money, but what am I really supposed to be doing? What is my function? And we've moved really, really far away from everybody having a purpose and a function to being, oh, well, the ministers do this, the ministers do that, the elders do this, the deacons do that. They're all the doers. The rest of us, well, we don't have those gifts, so we don't. And the ones getting hurt the most in that mentality are women. Women are walking away from the church at a rate twice as fast as men. Because essentially, and this was one of the brutal discussions that I got to be a part of, where Tyler was the in-between man before he was even a youth minister. I feel like the only thing that girls and women are good for is baking cookies and taking care of the babies. All we ever do in church is boom, 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 and she was rapid firing at him. Now, she was feeding him her mom's words, because her mom really didn't want to be a part of the church. The mom was obviously indoctrinating the daughter. On the positive side, it was a text session. So she was texting Tyler. Tyler was standing next to me on the putt-putt golf course in Missouri. And so he's like, okay, this is what she has said. Okay, don't type this. Hear what I say, think about it, and then say it in a way she can understand. And I won't tell you her response at one point, but suffice to say, leaving out the profanity, he heard her and she knew it. He understood her and she knew it. And boy, did it hurt that they weren't attending, because he was the first person to show her he cared. Unfortunately, that's a reason for walking away. If you can attend that long, years, and feel like nobody ever really cared you were there, and that's a child. If we don't give our children purpose and function, if we're baptizing them, we better be incorporating them into a functional position in the body. Because otherwise they feel like a hangnail. I'm the problem. I'm the youth. Youth are different. And I'm not saying that about this congregation. I'm talking about in general. Youth get treated as though they're a different group. College students get treated as though they're a different group, and then there's the church. If you feel like you've been cut off and are not really part of the body, you're going to have a hard time staying with the body. And you run out again? I saw the hand up. Okay. Gotcha. So it is a hard situation to deal with, because in too many ways, a body is not the way the church has been. It needs to become that again. I think one of the things that is great about Keystone Heights as a congregation, You're regularly communicating what is being done relative to the, I believe it's Boys Home in Georgia, and about the food pantry here that's local. That's helpful. We need to be working on body principles. I had a discussion, this was years ago, with another family when we were having problems with the youth. And I said, okay, we're going to have a hard time keeping the youth right now because we're losing our third youth minister in 4 years. Simple question. And I'm asking you as parents, not your kids. What part of the body are you? I don't know. I mean, since we stopped being teachers on Sunday morning, because I had them co-teaching the littlest kids, I want to say that was 3 and 4 year olds at that time. Since we stopped doing that, we haven't been really doing anything. I mean, my husband's title is a deacon, but he'll tell you right now, he doesn't know why he's a deacon other than so that somebody's got a title. The fact is, he's going to step down because he's not doing anything. He's not asked to do anything. I said, okay, if you feel that way, how do you think your kids feel right now? If you're feeling that helpless about it, that you're not really a functional part, your kids are feeling worse about this. Their kids are the kids that are still in the church today, because they took the time and made the effort with their kids to make sure they were involved, felt like they were a part. Every other kid pretty much in that group, not counting my own, is walking away. It's something that if we don't want to become part of the statistics, we need to become part of the difference. Part of that difference is recognizing that yes, right now in our world, it's heading in the wrong direction relative to the church. Right now, relative to the world, in the U.S., we are heading for some really, really bad times if we don't wake up and get a clue. Because statistically, it's even made it into, I don't remember if it was the New York Times, one of the bigger liberal newspapers. 40% of the generation coming up doesn't know if there's a God and doesn't care. And doesn't know if there's such a thing as right or wrong and doesn't care. They're also the generation suffering with the most mental issues. I will tell you right now, number one reason why they are suffering so badly is because they don't have a sense of right or wrong that is foundational. Because one moment somebody's getting up and saying, oh, if you act this way, you're wrong. And then that same person in the public eye is doing what they just condemned. Wow, right and wrong changes that fast. One day, if you treat a person this way, then you're a good person. The next day, you're a hypocrite, you're a racist, you're a gender phobia, whatever kind of thing. Half the reason, or maybe more than half the reason why they don't have a sense of right and wrong is because the world that they're living in is switching back and forth on what is an acceptable answer so fast they're tired of getting hit upside the head. We need to be providing a stable answer that they can be convicted about. Because the truth is, Christ came and fed. Everybody can be convicted about the rightness of helping their fellow man, period. We need to be firm on that answer. We need to be firm on the answer of, you know what? Being committed and convicted in a relationship, husband and wife, makes it a whole lot smoother. And if you both make that decision, the relationship can grow not only for you, but for your children as well. That's another one. We need to take a stand on that and grow it. Why? Because right now the world is saying, hey, it's all good with my honey until, well, that one looks really sweet. And I'm really stressed, so this is even better right now, and it's all okay. They're catching that on TV, they're catching it in the movies, they're catching it as far as the news reports and so forth. And I've gone way past my time, so I'll hush. But yes, this is a critical discussion topic that unfortunately is going not sideways, but going the wrong ways. And if we don't want that bell curve on the downside to start speeding up real fast, we need to be looking at the issues of conviction, commitment, the rightness of God's word, and being a functional part of the body that is recognized and is necessary. Thank you all very much.